The heat wave is over, but with millions cramming onto beaches around the country this week, will it be too late to prevent a second spike? And that's going to be our final story of this evening. First of all, though, we've got a lot to get through. We're going to talk about the fallout from Starmer sacking RLB yesterday, and also Nadeem Zahawi making it very clear how you can have an impact on Conservative Party policy, which is to buy a seat at a fundraising dinner. To talk about all of those issues, I'm joined, as ever, on Friday evening by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very well, Michael. How are you doing?
Very well. I was a bit disappointed that so much happened this week, because I was going to spend most of yesterday sort of out in the sun, and then obviously Keir Starmer, did what he did, and we had to do a show. And now we're going to have a weekend full of rain. But it's okay. I feel like some coolness will mean we can work a bit harder. As ever, share the show link. And let's get some more people on here tonight. Tweet your comments on the hashtag Tisky Sour. You might be able to see my dog wandering around in the background. She's sort of refusing to sit down, but she's very quiet, so don't worry, she won't interrupt. On yesterday's show, we covered in detail Starmer's sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey from the shadow cabinet. We said it was an overreaction and a politically motivated decision which undermined Starmer's claim to want to unify the party. What we didn't know, it was too early to say, was how the left would respond. Today, we do have some more sense of that. So the Socialist Campaign Group, it's a group of left-wing MPs, met with Keir Starmer via Skype this morning. And afterwards, they released this statement. So it says, the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs met this morning with Labour leader Keir Starmer on the sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey from the shadow cabinet. It was clear that significant disagreement remains on this point. The Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs made it clear that Rebecca Long-Bailey should not have been sacked and should be reinstated. The imminent annexation of the West Bank by Israel's government was discussed, and the need for the Labour Party MPs, party members and supporters to speak out against Israel's illegal annexation and ongoing human rights abuses by the government of Israel was raised. Concerns were also raised about the party response to the review into leaks and the 2017 electoral sabotage, and especially the treatment of black MPs. This was a business-like exchange of views which took place in a mutually respectful manner. There doesn't seem to have been much more news, really. There were fewer developments than we might have expected. No one's resigned yet. Lloyd Russell Moyles, speaking to the Times, didn't rule it out. I think they asked him about it directly. He didn't rule it out. I don't think it was him saying I might do. But Aaron, what do you make of this response?
What do you expect? I mean, it's like jelly. As I understand it, there's sort of diverging views about this in the Socialist Campaign Group. I mean, to all intents and purposes, it's a paper organisation. It doesn't really mean anything. Something we're increasingly finding out. Outstanding people in it. Many of the people in it are outstanding. But it's one thing to have a group of brilliant individual parliamentarians. It's another thing to have an organisation which is acting collectively with a long-term strategy. I don't think the SCG, the Socialist Campaign Group, lives up to that second standard, which will be necessary. Yes, you want lots of left-wing MPs in Parliament, but they have to be organised. And if they're not organised, you can have 50, 60, 70, 80. It doesn't matter. Organisation is what exerts influence, which is what makes change. And it will be the thing that keeps the left alive through potentially a difficult period. Or we hope, actually, Keir Starmer doing really well, uniting a broad tent party and being one part within a much broader effort, although his actions yesterday seem to completely undermine that previously successful message of unity. But I am disappointed that, there's nothing really substantive coming out of this. As we were saying yesterday, Rebecca Long-Bailey, he could have sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey yesterday and said, look, she's made a mistake. I have all the respect for her in the world, but I said this has been my number one sort of red line, and she has to be more attentive to it. And I think a lot of people have gone, okay. But the manner in which it was conducted, I'll post this, actually delete it and post this. And then the message she gave to the BBC is she shared an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Completely not true. I mean, it's practically libelous. That's how she'll be remembered for a very long time. That didn't need to happen. So malicious, so malevolent. And I would have hoped that some of her colleagues and comrades in the Socialist Campaign Group kick back, whether that's privately or publicly. But it sounds like they've done neither.
Well, I think they probably have done privately. They've said they disagree with what he's done. Apparently, one of the demands they've put forward is to put a left-winger in her place, in Rebecca Long Bailey's
I
place
don't
as
get
education or shadow education secretary. And the idea is that's supposed to prove that this wasn't actually about purging a left-winger. It was about what Rebecca Long Bailey shared. I mean, I don't think it's particularly likely that he's going to secede to that.
Such a weak demand. It's such a weak demand.
Well, what would you do though? Because there is a catch-22 situation, isn't there? Because if they resign, then he doesn't need to purge the left because they'll have self-purged, as it were. There aren't enough MPs really to mount a proper challenge. Potentially, you could have a leadership challenge, but it's way too early to do that when the guy's got a mandate from the members.
There's also, even if he didn't, there's a national crisis. That's not appropriate.
Yeah, so it's difficult to see what they can do to really escalate because, I mean, as we said on yesterday's show, they don't have much institutional power within the PLP. The best thing the left can do, in my mind, is win those seats on the NEC, and that might make Keir Starmer have to pay more attention to the left wing of the party. But it's difficult to see what else the MPs can do.
I mean, well, you just vocally go out there. There's so many of them. You put a statement out saying Rebecca Long Bailey did not say anything which was tantamount to an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And it's scandalous that a party leader would say something so clearly and brazenly untrue about a colleague. And furthermore, this is tantamount to the exact kind of workplace bullying and public degradation which characterised, as we now know as a result of the Labour leaks, senior management of the Labour Party right up until 2017, 2018, under the stewardship of Ian McNicol. And what this tells us is we're back to business as usual. It's no surprise that we're seeing, I think we will see a whitewash of that leak report, by the way. I think maybe you have one or two scalps. We know that, I broke this story last week, there's been a few people suspended. We only know that because a member he's taking Labour to court. Two members of the senior management team have been suspended. That should be national news. Of course, if Jeremy Corbyn was the leader and two members of the SNT had been suspended, it would be national news. But with the Labour right, they play by a different set of rules. We only know that because of, like I say, a private prosecution. He wants that to be referred to the CPS for fraud. He wants to effectively go after David Evans, the incoming General Secretary, and Ian McNicol, the former General Secretary, under a charge of fraud. Might not work. You might think that's silly. But that's what he's going for. And that's the only reason why we're in receipt of the names of those who've been suspended. By the way, that wasn't divulged publicly. I managed to ascertain that from various sources. But we're looking at a whitewash here. And so I think it's really important to actually highlight connections between this style of management and the clearly self-defeating modus operandi under Ian McNicol.
I think that point you made about the left and the right playing to different rules is also really important, because what you'll hear is people say, well, why are the left complaining? All you have to do is not tweet anything that could possibly be interpreted as having anti-Semitic undertones. You know, say even the fact that someone could claim it's anti-Semitic is enough that you should resign, and people on the right don't do this. Now, there was something we didn't mention on last night's show, which has been, I mean, really infuriating me today, actually, which is that the person who some people are suggesting could replace Rebecca Long Bailey, and regardless of that retains a very high profile position in the shadow cabinet, is Rachel Reeves. And Rachel Reeves, as well as saying that the Labour Party should be tougher on benefit claimants than the Conservatives when she was in the shadow DWP role in 2013, earlier this year tweeted a tweet thread which was completely celebratory about Nancy Astor. Nancy Astor was the first female MP to sit in Parliament. She was not the first to be elected. That was Constance Markovich, but she was a member of Sinn Féin, so she did not take up her seat. I'm going to go to this tweet first, and then we're going to go look at some of the context and why this should have been an issue that would have caused problems for Rachel Reeves. And if she were a left-winger, there's no doubt it would have done. So let's get this up. On this day, 100 years ago, the first speech by a woman in the House of Commons was given by Nancy Astor, MP for Plymouth Sutton, between 1919 and 1945. It's quite, we don't really need to go through all of it, but the important context is that there's 7 tweets there, right? So it's quite a long thread, and she never mentioned anti-Semitism. Now let's look at why she might have thought it was appropriate to mention anti-Semitism when celebrating the life of Nancy Astor. We're going to go to a quote now from the Jewish Chronicle, which explains why celebrating this woman is a little bit problematic. Let's get this up. So she once complained the Observer, this is Nancy Astor, which belonged to her husband's family, was full of homosexuals and Jews, and worked to bar the hiring of Jews and Catholics from the Sunday newspaper's senior positions, a position staff later had to work to undo after her involvement in the Observer Trust came to an end. She also wrote letters to the US ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, in which she suggested the Nazis were a solution to the world's problems of Jewry and communism. She told Kennedy Hitler would have to do more than give a rough time to the killers of Christ for her to want Britain and America to launch Armageddon to save them. The wheel of history swings round as the Lord would have it. Who are we to stand in the way of the future? She was seen as being so pro-German that she was referred to as the member for Berlin during a 1939 House of Commons debate. Now, the fact that she can share that, long tweet thread, there's plenty of time to say, oh, yes, okay, she was the first MP to sit down, not sit down, but the first MP to sit in Parliament, which is, a significant role to play in history, but also she had these appalling views, and we obviously cannot ignore the fact that she was a literal Nazi sympathizer, right? But no, there was none of that context, and no one even asked her to apologize, right? So this was a couple of months before Starmer was elected leader. She's given a very high-profile role in his cabinet. He's on the coronavirus task force, his shadow cabinet. My apologies. And yeah, no complaints, nothing. And you might say to me, oh, but this was in the past. She's talking about a historical figure. The thing that Rebecca Long Bailey shared, that was about current politics. Now, do you remember a book called Imperialism by Hobson, which Jeremy Corbyn had written an introduction to? Now, that book contains an anti-Semitic quote, terrible. But this was someone who was writing about imperialism in the 19th century, and the downfall of many people in that century was their racism. Corbyn didn't mention that qualification in the forward, and it was a national scandal, right? Now, Rachel Reeves can just leave this tweet thread up, and what annoys me more than the fact that she didn't apologize is that no one's demanded her to. It's just not an issue when it's a right winger. Just doesn't matter. It doesn't even cross anyone's minds that she should have to apologize for the fact that she's celebrating someone who was a literal Nazi apologist. Aaron.
Well, the thing is with the British establishment, if you stop celebrating Nazi apologists, you very quickly run out of people to celebrate. Particularly sort of amongst the senior milieux, the British establishment before the Second World War, including people within the royal family, including, for instance, members of the Prince Philip's family, including Baden-Powell. It was a very common sense position. Winston Churchill writes in a letter, if I was Italian, no doubt I would have been amongst the followers of Mussolini. This was a very common thing to be saying, because the interwar period following the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, was a time of great uncertainty. And if you were conservative, these strongmen were incredibly appealing political figures. And the left was resistant to that. They wanted to highlight the shortcomings of what became Francoism, the far-right government in Spain after a failed revolution. Particularly a black anti-colonial left wants to highlight that the Ethiopian War, overseen by the Italians in the mid-1930s, was a colonial fascist war. And they were very eager. This is really important. And this is why actually the British establishment can't publicly lambast somebody who's celebrating Lady Nancy Astor. It's because while often you hear the kind of horseshoe theory, well, fascism and communism are kind of the same thing. If we want to have a really serious analytical approach to this, actually, fascism and colonialism are broadly the same thing. They have many, many points of similarity. Something I was talking about with Priya Gopal earlier this week. The idea of Lebensraum, of the sort of the Third Reich occupying land to its east, was taken out of settler colonial discourses. The idea of exterminating many, many people. Germany doesn't do that for the first time with Jews, with socialists, with homosexuals, with gypsies, with the disabled after 1933. The first time they do that actually is against the Herero people in what is today's Namibia in the early 1900s. And they very explicitly say we need a final solution. We're going to exterminate the Herero people. They're not really human. And so you see real congruence between the colonial missions of the European states and what became fascism. And for somebody like Lady Nancy Astor, you see her approach to fascism, the fact she's a Nazi apologist. You see what Winston Churchill says about Mussolini and how, had he been Italian, he would have been one of his followers. And that all of a sudden makes incredibly clear the relationship between colonialism and between fascism. Now, I'm not the only one saying this. There were a number, by the way, 600,000 African service personnel fought for the British Empire during the Second World War. Many of those people that went back to their countries, like Kenya, like Malawi, like Tanzania, went back to those countries and then fought against British dominion. And they quite openly and explicitly say, we thought we were just fighting against this, but actually it's the same thing. George Padmore said it, a Jamaican left-wing intellectual. He said, Europeans, through colonialism, have practiced all of the things that the Third Reich has done, but the Germans, their typically Teutonic efficiency, have taken it to its logical conclusion. And that's why the British establishment cannot denigrate somebody like a Lady Nancy Astor, because actually she personifies a much broader issue which goes right to the heart of colonialism and effectively the psychotic death wish of British Empire and its relationship to 20th century fascism.
And that's the problem, right? So the reason people were so comfortable complaining to Jeremy Corbyn about his preface to the Hobson book about imperialism was because it was an anti-imperialist text. And what the establishment are obsessed with is this idea that anti-imperialism is essentially also anti-Semitic. So it's this idea that these two things could not be separated. But now when you say that colonialism and British imperial past is intrinsically connected to fascism, they don't want to hear that. They're very happy to put the anti-Semitism of British imperialists in the past, but the anti-Semitism of anti-imperialists in the past, no, they're saying that, oh no, that makes it an intrinsic part of anti-imperialism. And it just seems so, I haven't really heard anyone justify why it's fine for Rachel Reeves to share this tweet thread, but it's not fine for Jeremy Corbyn to do a preface to that Hobson book about imperialism. And the reason I've never heard anyone explain that is because no one in the mainstream media ever bothers asking any of these questions. We're supposed to just accept the fact that, look, this number of MPs are upset about it, which means it's a real issue. No one who we think is influential or has a position of power cares about it. Therefore, it's not a real issue. It's never based on the actual merits of the argument at hand. It's just based on who does and who doesn't care. And often the people who do care are the people who, are happy to forgive racism when it's in the establishment, but are very quick to insinuate racism when someone has said something which potentially threatens the establishment. Well, I'm not saying, by the way, that's what Hobson in that text, there's explicit anti-Semitism, never defend that, right? But the point is how historical figures are treated so inconsistently depending on what political tradition they are thought to represent.
One more thing as well, Toby Perkins, who's serving in the shadow cabinet, has been, very clear in engaging with anti-traveller racism. We know that about 1.5 million gypsies, travellers, were killed during the Holocaust. We know more than a million, probably about 1.5 million. And yet this gentleman is allowed in the shadow cabinet. Rachel Reeves is allowed in the shadow cabinet, but Rebecca Long-Bailey, for tweeting an article, interview with Maxine Peake, one line, the detail was slightly wrong, but the broader point was a politically salient one and an important one to make, has to go. And so you've got the one point of, clearly, by Keir Starmer, this is just a factional move. The other point is, wow, you're actually giving a free pass to quite serious instances of people undermining any serious kind of anti-racist message or politics within the party more generally. And the reality is, by the way, that Keir Starmer and the people around him, they think that wins votes. They think a little bit of racism wins votes. They believe that. There's a reason why, and we talked about it last night briefly. Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner did the kind of knee for the BLM stuff. Great. I'm glad they did it. I'd rather they do it than not do it. But the reason they did it is because they're not going to do anything else. They're not going to have any substantive policy offer or engagement with BLM. Football clubs are having more of an engagement with Black Lives Matter than the Labour Party. But the Labour Party, we have a proud tradition of anti-racism. Keir Starmer today, 75 years, the UN, we've been at the heart of the rule of law and human rights. Go tell that to the people of Iraq. Go tell that to the people of Kenya or the Chagos Islanders. Go tell that to the people of Malaya. Go tell that to the people of Indonesia. All right, when the Dutch tried to reconquer it after 1945, 200,000 Indonesians died, that anti-colonial war of national liberation. Who was helping the Dutch? Well, the Americans were financing it and British armed forces were there. But, and then this is another thing about Keir Starmer and why people like James O'Brien are going to love him, is because he repeats a completely fabricated myth about the kind of country Britain is and has been. He tells a story about Britain, a rule of law, it's crap. It is absolute crap. Anybody remotely familiar with Britain's role in the world since 1945 knows they don't stand for the rule of law. I mean, like I say, from Kenya, the concentration camps in all the way from the start of the 20th century, fighting two Boer wars, actually late 19th century, through to Kenya. Today, you can Google this. Jomo Kenyatta Airport, big airport in Nairobi, one of the biggest, most busiest airports in Kenya. It was built with forced labor. At the time, the International Labour Organization, the ILO, said this is illegal. You're using political prisoners who haven't even been tried for anything. They're not being charged with anything. And you're using them for forced labor more than, I think it was 90 days a year or whatever. Something to that effect. The ILO said it was definitely not permissible. And yet, we stand by the rule of law. It's just astonishing. And there's a reason, I'm talking too much here, but there's a reason, 9% of Germans think that the German Empire, there was a German Empire before, primarily before the First World War, there was an Imperial German Empire. 9% of Germans think it was a good thing. 30% of Brits think the British Empire was a good thing. We have not confronted our past. And the whole point of BLM is we confront our past. We confront where these attitudes and practices and values and accumulations of power today, which are heavily racialized, where do they come from? And the whole point of Keir Starmer and how he allows particularly people in the centre to kind of evade and elide Britain's colonial past and the tragedy, frankly, of what this country has done to much of the rest of the world over the last 200 years. He gives them permission to sort of say, well, that never really happened. I mean, how dare you in the context of BLM?
We've got an interesting question which sort of relates to, moving on from the question of claims of anti-Semitism, is how the left can, I suppose, fight back if Keir Starmer is trying to purge progressives within the party. Omar Siddiqui with a $4.99 super chat, thank you very much, says, genuine question, what happened to the influence of momentum within Labour? How has the left been sidelined so badly all of a sudden? It's a very good question. And I think, I'll go to Aaron in a moment, but my answer would be that, the Labour left still hasn't worked out precisely what its role is going to be, right? So for a long time, the role of momentum was to defend Jeremy Corbyn, to try and help Labour win elections when everyone in HQ was actively working against it, and to, go out there and sort of make arguments on social media, especially, which would show what the mainstream media was saying about Corbyn to be, wholly false, right? But now, obviously, Starmer doesn't need them to be backing him up, and also what momentum should be doing at this point in time is putting pressure on Keir Starmer so that he can't do things. He can't just sack a left winger because they've retweeted an article about an actor in a mainstream newspaper, right? But it's difficult to know where that leverage is. Obviously, as I've already said, one of them is going to be organising not just a united left slate, but a united left slate of really talented, exceptional people who can go on TV, make good arguments, who can, act flexibly when they're in NEC meetings to actually outmaneuver the right. Not just sitting there and you hope they vote at the right time. Exactly. Really exceptional people who potentially will become exceptional left-wing MPs, right? I think that's kind of, I suppose I've answered my own question. What should momentum be doing? It should be, building the infrastructure, which means that they can promote, build up the character, the power of exceptional left-wing progressives.
Michael, I heard you on BBC Radio 2, I think it was today, right, with Jeremy Vine.
Yeah, on Jeremy Vine.
Yeah, he's such a charming guy. He's in his own way. I think he's one of the best hosts because you never actually know what he really believes or thinks, which is that's an achievement. That's good. And I thought, and I shared it on Twitter. Novara posted this great excerpt. I think it's 2 minutes 30, and you just nailed it. You were so succinct. And now, so people are saying, well, Novara, they're talking heads, the media talking heads, they're sort of praising one another. Here's the reality. Thousands of members of the Labour Party can do what Michael did today. Either they can already do it, or they could do it with a little bit of practice if they do it for a year or two and a bit of training. I know thousands of people can do that. The sad thing about the last 5 years is they have not been elevated. And like you say, Michael, yeah, maybe they should be MPs. They should also be councillors. They should be council leaders. They should be city mayors. They could be holding all number of, police and crime commissioners, all manner of public roles. And they're not. Why haven't we fast-tracked these thousands of really stunningly impressive people in this country? Like you say, and there's a reason why, and it's because there's a huge amount of caution within the Corbyn project, sadly. Huge amount of caution in many, many ways. But like you say, momentum now have to rectify that. And I don't have much faith in momentum as an organisation. It's a cipher, But I do have a great deal of faith in these two slates. I think there's an immense amount of talent on both slates. And I think, there's enough there. I'm pretty confident. It's one of the very few things I'm very confident and sort of optimistic about for these people to push the left forward. They're going to face incredibly difficult circumstances because this time the establishment in the Labour Party is prepared for the left, but hugely talented people. And so I agree with you. I think what they need to do is momentum in particular need to focus on 6-7 areas whether it's selecting councillors, getting parliamentary candidates selected next time, and building up real bases of political strength. Could be in 4 or 5 cities and a couple of towns. Could be in maybe one particular region, one particular nation. But that's going to be really critical now, because believe it or not, the left still has all the ideas. It still has most of the people. If you, the vast majority of the people behind Keir Starmer, we'd like to rejoin the EU and we'd like things to be a bit less shit. Well, when unemployment hits 20% and the deficit goes from 20 to 25%, when we see millions of people's mortgages be completely screwed in the second half of this year, that's not a sufficient politics. And that's why it's really, really important. Don't leave the Labour Party. Stay, vote for vote for this left slate and the NEC, and get these talented, courageous people into the positions they deserve.
A couple of things I should probably say about Momentum before we finish this discussion. One is, I do actually know they are currently recruiting for a councillor network, so I don't want to imply they're not doing these things already. I don't know many details about it, I have to say. And also the Momentum National Coordinating Group elections, you have 4 days left to vote if you are a member. And if you don't know which slate to vote for, there's Momentum Renewal and Forward Momentum. They should have chosen names which were more different, but what can you do? I hosted a debate between representatives from both slates last week. You can check that out on our YouTube. At the moment, we have 2,200 people watching live. Let's get that closer to 3,000. And we're going to go to our next story. First, though, I'm going to put my phone on silent. That's very unprofessional from me. Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick should have already resigned in disgrace. He overruled the government's planning inspector to give permission for a £1 billion development by a man who had sat next to him at a fundraising dinner and who he had been personally texting. Even worse, he gave permission on the day before an infrastructure levy was to be introduced that would have meant the developer in question, Richard Desmond, would need to pay £40 million to health services and schools. Internal emails show Jenrick had specifically pushed for it to be approved before the new measures came in, and that Desmond had texted him saying, "We don't want them Marxists. We don't want to give them Marxist dough." The Marxists in question were Tower Hamlets Council, the democratically elected council of the London Borough with the highest rates of income poverty. And of course, they're not Marxists. They're a moderate Labour Party council. Anyway, we talked about this on Wednesday. It's obviously all a complete disgrace. Obviously, Jenrick should have resigned in disgrace by now from the cabinet. His position as an MP should be, in question. But no, if the last 2 months has taught us anything, it is that corruption and law breaking are perfectly acceptable in Johnson's government, so long as you're loyal to him. So on Thursday, Business Minister Nadhim Zahawi was sent out onto the airwaves to defend what Jenrick had done, to try and make out that it was nothing extraordinary. And he made quite an extraordinary admission. Let's take a listen to him speaking on Radio 4.
You're not going to address this point, are you, about your voter in Doncaster or Ashfield and whether they have this kind of access to government that this billionaire has? You will address it. Talk to them directly. Why don't they have this kind of access?
Well, first of all, what I've tried to address through this whole interview...
No, why don't they have this kind of access?
Well, if people go to a fundraiser in their local area in Doncaster for the Conservative Party, they'll be sitting next to MPs and other people in their local authority.
Is that the way into this?
So the cat is really out of the bag there, isn't it? If you want preferential access to a Tory MP, to a government minister even, what should you do? You should buy a seat at your next local Tory fundraiser, right? The whole premise of the idea that our party funding system isn't corrupt is the idea that you're not supposed to be able to buy access. There's always this, everyone always knew it was false, but this claim that sort of like, just because they come to the dinner, that they don't buy their ticket to the dinner because they think that will affect policy. They buy their ticket to the dinner because they independently support government policy, which is in no way doing any favors for them personally because they gave the party money. Now, Nadhim Zahawi is just saying outright, you want to influence government policy? Fine. Buy a ticket to a Tory fundraiser. And he's almost making out this is democratic because anyone can buy a ticket to a Tory fundraiser. But anyone with lots of money can buy tickets to this is the whole point. This is why you don't do democracy. You don't have a system whereby you can get access to decision makers if you have lots of money. That's not democracy.
Well, it's the whole thing about we have the best democracy money can buy. I mean, that's often, that's been a sort of a joke. It's been sort of satirical, cynical take on liberal democracies since, really since the collapse of Labour-based socialist movements since the 50s, 60s, 70s. But Nadim Zahawi is actually saying, yes, this is the best democracy money can buy. And it's democracy because you can buy influence. That's kind of, like you say, they're so unaccustomed to actually having to defend their big ideological claims and presumptions. They're so unaccustomed to defending it. So, of course you should be able to buy influence. That's a democracy. And I'm sure he believes that. I mean, when is Nadim Zahawi going to be, we challenge one another. Oh no, that's a great thing on the left. You have to really refine your arguments, right? Because if you've got something slightly wrong, my God, heaven help you. But somebody like Nadim Zahawi, nobody's going to correct him. Nobody cares. And so they just come up with this gumph, and it's getting progressively worse because we're now becoming a managed democracy. That is to say, the democratic features of the post-war era, I think, are really coming apart, at light speed. I think this was an articulation of that. He kind of doesn't even care if he makes sense. He's just like, well, yeah, you buy the influence you want, and that's the British way.
And I mean, the reason they can have this much confidence, because I mean, if you go on, if a left winger goes on the radio with an argument that bad, you just wouldn't go on the radio with an argument that bad because they'll destroy you, right? But if you're a right winger, you can go out and say any kind of bullshit, and then you can just assume that the news story is going to move on in a few hours, even. Because the way they keep things like this in the newspapers, if it's a left winger who does it, is they bring up all of these different figures from the establishment to keep it a story, to sort of say, this backbench right wing Labour MP is saying this. So if they're saying that what's happened is if they're saying that Corbyn someone pretending he was friends with a spy in the 1980s, if they're saying that's important, it must be important. But here you have, the Tories who actually have discipline, which means that none of them are coming out and really speaking against this. You have the BBC, someone like Laura Kuenssberg, who doesn't really do any research into like the facts of the matter or what's actually happened. She just checks WhatsApp. So if there's no one WhatsApping to say, this thing's actually a big deal, then they won't realize, right? And the news cycle has already moved on.
Yeah.
And you've got Keir Starmer completely playing into their hands by saying, actually, the serious issue is that Rebecca Long-Bailey shared an article in a mainstream newspaper where an actor said something that was slightly wrong about the relationship of the Israeli police to the United States police.
Yeah.
Right. And that is now a more well-known controversy than the Robert Jenrick one.
And that matters more than somebody trying to avoid £50 million worth of tax, which would have gone to one of the poorest parts of our capital city. Right. There were people today sharing this opinion poll saying, I think 45% think that it was right to get rid of Rebecca Long-Bailey, 12% disagree, and then 41% don't know. That's what I would expect. Nobody knows who Rebecca Long-Bailey is. They're like, what the hell? Where's this come from? Even I'm a sort of, I love politics. I'm interested in this. We're hosting a show on it. And even I was like, what the hell? This is crazy. Where's this come from? So it's the average person, of course. What's interesting is more people thought that Rebecca Long-Bailey should be sacked than thought that Robert Jenrick should be sacked. Well done. Slow clap for Keir Starmer. Wow, real political genius. Now the electorate thinks that there was more reason for Rebecca Long-Bailey to go. By the way, there was none whatsoever. Than somebody who was assisting a billionaire to avoid £50 million worth of tax. I don't think anybody thinks that is not as bad as what Rebecca Long-Bailey did. But because of the kind of the politicking forensic style of Keir Starmer, that's where we've ended up.
And the worst thing about it, that poll, I wish we'd put it in the script actually, but I mean, you can check it out. I've retweeted it today. Is that the reason why more people in the public think that Rebecca Long-Bailey should have resigned than Robert Jenrick isn't because they judge what she's done to be more serious. It's because the don't knows in the Robert Jenrick case are lower. So it's not that people think what Rebecca Long-Bailey did is worse than what Robert Jenrick did. It's that they've heard more about Rebecca Long-Bailey tweeting an article of an interview of an actor speaking to The Independent than they have about a housing minister who had a fundraising dinner with a property developer who watched a video advertising this sort of development on the phone at that dinner, who was texting that property developer about how they were going to try and, stop this man having to pay £40 million to a London council for health services and education, right? And no one's heard of it because the news cycle is gone.
Well, it's also too complicated.
It's not even that complicated. It's it's corruption. It's not. It shouldn't be complicated. The problem here is how Keir Starmer making something an issue when it shouldn't really have been an issue. And then the media, if not enough Tory backbenchers send a message to Laura Kuenssberg or Robert Peston, then they just forget about the story.
But you have to understand, with the Labour left, you can go anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. 4 words. Goodbye. Career over. I go, Robert Jenrick was, potentially took a handout, and there's money and there's the business. I've switched off. Sorry, it has to be 4 words. You're right. Cash for access. I think that's a great way of putting it. But the 4 words, and that's what destroys them. And look, by the way, this enmity and prejudice against the left, it infuses the whole thing to such an extent where you'll hear, whenever you actually, bless it, you were introduced quite nicely, I thought, on BBC Two today, but controversial, and we've got controversial contributing editor Michael Walker from the controversial Novara Media, and we have Julie Hartley Brewer, of course, from Talk Radio. What the hell?
Yeah.
And they're always alt-left controversial. Wait, hold on. Wait. We're regulated by Impress. We're a newer organization. We've got fewer resources because we haven't got big money backers like Talk Radio. But wait. Where's this framing come from? We know where the framing's come from. These people all hang out together. They all go to the same schools. They all live in the same places. They've all known one another 15, 20 years. It's the bubble that runs this country, and it's not just in politics; it's in the media too. And if you're from outside it, you're controversial. Even though the Spectator publish articles, with titles like "In Praise of the Vim Act," that's not controversial. But Aaron Bastani, Mr. Controversial, he's in the Novara Media. Wow, he didn't go to the school I went to. He doesn't live in N1. He wasn't at the Spectator summer party, so he must be controversial.
And people have said he's controversial. Because this is always their plausible denial. You ask, well, why is he controversial? So, well, other people say he's controversial. I'm not here to have an opinion. I just explain what other people say. But by you repeating that, you are becoming one of those people. And that is, again, that's got a lot to do with this idea that now all these headlines are Rebecca Long-Bailey sacked for tweeting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's suddenly become a fact that Rebecca Long-Bailey tweets anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, whereas she tweeted an interview with a famous actor in a national newspaper. I probably should actually say why I don't think it's quite right to call this an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, because I got a DM after last night's show saying we sort of brushed over it too quickly. Respectful DM, I always appreciate those. But the reason I think it is that even though what Maxime Peake said was unevidenced, it doesn't seem like there's any evidence really that the Israeli secret services trained the American police how to do a neck hold, how to kneel on someone's neck, the action that killed George Floyd. I doubt you need to be taught that by foreign governments, because it seems quite simple to me. The exchanges between American police and Israeli police seem to have been more about counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, although obviously we all know that counterterrorism policing doesn't just impact terrorists. So, I'm sure all sorts of aggressive methods of policing have been learnt within that relationship. But I think it was a misjudged thing to say. But the reason why I'm skeptical or wary to call that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is because what we do is we raise the costs so high of getting anything wrong about Israel or about American police. It's to say, it's okay to talk about the connection between racist police in Israel and racist police in the United States if you get every single detail right. And you should obviously try and get every detail right, especially if you're talking to a national newspaper. It's good to check your facts. But if you say you get something wrong about that, suddenly means that you've bought into an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I think that's a real problem, because we don't apply that standard to other issues. If you say something about Russia having done XYZ Facebook ad during the referendum, and it turns out that what you said was slightly untrue, you don't get called a racist, right? And the issue here, I think, is that people have sort of suggested, and Stephen Bush actually did it this morning in his New Statesman email, is to say that why would they be focusing on the Israeli police and not the British police or the French police? Why? And the only reason he posited was because it's the only majority Jewish state in the world, right? It is, but it's also the longest running occupation in the world. They've been occupying Palestinian territories for 52 years. If you think they've been occupying Palestinian territories from 1948, even longer, but everyone agrees they've been occupying Palestinian territories for 52 years. And unlike Britain or France, they're currently practicing settler colonialism. Unlike Britain or France, they have a constitution, which means the police have to become experts in suppressing a racialized subject group. I was going to say a racialized minority, but I'm not sure Palestinians actually are a minority in Israel, Palestine at this point in time. So that would be a misnomer. It's similar to South Africa. When there was apartheid going on in South Africa, you'd often get people draw connections between what the South African police do and what the American police do. And it's because what was going on in South Africa was an extreme case of what was going on in the United States, just as in many ways what's going on in Israel in terms of the policing of racialized, powerless groups is an extreme case of what's going on in the United States. And again, I think another thing that's important to mention is that when this was going on, this relationship between Americans who were fighting against racism and, let's go back to the South Africa example, South Africans who were fighting against apartheid, what drawing those connections did was it strengthened both movements. So it was partly those connections between Black Americans saying, our struggle is the same struggle as Black South Africans that led to, the public consciousness around the world of South African apartheid and the evils of it being discovered. And that was one of the things, that led to the boycott and led to ultimately the fall of apartheid. So international solidarity works. And that's precisely why I think many people want to make it so that the costs of speaking about the connections between racism in the United States and racism in Israel are so high that the moment you get the slightest detail wrong, everyone says, well, one, they got a slight detail wrong, which means it's a conspiracy theory. And two, it must be that they're now sort of dabbling in essentially anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, because why have they got this detail wrong about Israel? Why are they not getting details wrong about France? So I think if we say Maxine Peake, what she said was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory because it involved Israel and it wasn't quite true, then we're playing their game, and that undermines the possibility of international solidarity. Aaron, any more comments on this issue before we?
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. It's like saying, if we were to say the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein, they come to power in Iraq, actually with the help of the British security services, often not talked about. Let's say you talk about that and they were a very repressive regime, but you get something slightly wrong about the Ba'ath Party, horrific regime under Saddam Hussein in particular. He was a particular element within the Ba'ath Party. It wasn't, the Ba'ath Party wasn't the major problem. It was Saddam Hussein and how he basically staged an internal coup. If you get a slight part of that wrong, nobody says you're an Islamophobe, right? Or if you're talking about the rise of Muammar Gaddafi and Lockerbie and you get something wrong, nobody goes, oh yeah, you're an Islamophobe. You hate Muslims. Nobody says that. It's crazy. And again, I read that. By the way, I have some respect for Stephen Bush, but I thought it was such an intellectually dishonest what he wrote this morning. And we talked about this yesterday. It's because the state of Israel, they had a war in Lebanon in 1982. They've been occupying, nobody disputes this. The UN study doesn't dispute it for more than 50 years. They occupied part of Syria. They occupied part of Egypt for a bit. They're really good. This is quite a unique way of behaving in the world, right? People haven't been annexing territory in this way. It's been very uncommon since the Second World War. When Russia did it with the Ukraine, people were rightly up in arms because it's like a really odd thing to do. But this is actually the modus operandi of the Israeli state. And so it's an entirely justified thing to it's not a reach. And also the other thing, by the way, I have to say this. I saw Shappi Khorassandi, comedian, she's Iranian, and she said, oh, Corbyn never mentions Iran. Are you kidding me? Jeremy Corbyn has criticized the Islamic Republic of Iran more than any other politician. This guy was standing up for the Chagos Islanders. The Chagos Islanders are it was part of a broader set of islands that were depopulated. It was actually just one particular island was depopulated. It was an air base that was given to the United States, I think, under Harold Wilson. He stood up for all of these people, Kurds. Just because you don't know it, don't call the guy a race guy. He's only ever talking about Israel. Well, no, he's not. Are you now going to apologize? Of course you won't. Really horrific stuff. And you say that, and they go, "Wow." But, your ignorance is not my problem, right? Your ignorance, your complete unfamiliarity with the facts and the history of this man's voting record and his political activism is no excuse for you to defame and smear him repeatedly, even though he's not even leading the Labour Party anymore. These people are crazy. They're unhinged.
All right, we're going to go to our final story of the evening. First of all, if you're watching this, make sure you give us a like. We want to get up. We want to get. I don't know how many we've got at this point in time. I can't see them, but let's get them as high as possible before we end. It helps on the algorithm. Also, if you're enjoying this show, please hit the subscribe button, and we want to get to 100,000 by the end of the summer. The combination of glorious sunshine and a loosening of the lockdown has meant millions of Britons have flooded to the beach this week. Apologies. Images of crowded beaches fill our TV screens, and the story has also made many of Britain's front pages today. Let's take a look at some of these. We got on the Times. Can we get this up? Sunseekers risk new virus spike as beaches crammed. The Daily Mail. Don't throw it all away. So the Health Secretary's plea to people to continue social distancing when they're on the beach. And then we've got the mirror with a sort of picture of the beach's boiling point, so you can see how busy it is there. So none of this is surprising. The government have given people express permission to travel to any part of the country they want. They're encouraging staycations. The message is basically, you know, if you want to feel like you're on holiday, go to the British seaside, right? So it's not a surprise that this busyness is happening. The problem for locals is that these places aren't really, you know, designed to have this many people visit them all at once, and many are unable to cope. Also, on top of this, obviously, if you've got so many people going to a small area, it becomes very, very difficult to social distance. And this problem was not unforeseen. So Peter Kyle, a Labour MP for Hove, on Tuesday asked Boris Johnson how towns like his would be able to cope with high volumes of people, especially without a track and trace app. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is good news that people can start socialising and meeting in public again. But what is he going to do to make sure that destination communities, such as the one I represent in Brighton and Hove, are extra safe? Because there will be people who will be meeting and drinking on places like the seafront and in parks where it will be impossible to get the names and addresses of every customer. There will be other pinch points where lots of people from various destinations will be rubbing up against each other. What will he do in the absence of the promised app to make sure that these communities are destination for investment and not destination for COVID?
I think I will be calling on local representatives such as himself to show some guts and determination and champion their communities as venues for people to return to and to support.
So they should show some guts. You know, if someone asking a question, like obviously you've said people are free to go to the seaside. Presumably, you know, they knew a heat wave was coming. What are these towns going to be able to do to accommodate all of these people, and especially accommodate all of them in a safe way? Given, you know, they are ultimately, inevitably going to be, you know, confined to small places at periods of times. We don't yet have a track and trace app, which means that if it was the case that you were crammed up next to someone, you'll necessarily find out if they're a stranger. Well, it's not that you just won't find out if they're a stranger without an app, which we're not going to have until the winter. Very good question. Boris Johnson says, show some guts, you know. Show some guts. All you need is, again, it's this idea of self-belief. If you believe that your town can handle it, your town can handle it. The problem is that guts don't really help much in this situation, especially MPs don't even have control over how a town could accommodate itself to this kind of thing. Let's look at what did happen 2 days after this. So that happened on Tuesday. On Thursday, that was the hottest day of the year. So yesterday, Thursday, Bournemouth had to declare a major incident as 500,000 people flocked to the Dorset coast. So a major incident that the police there couldn't handle it. The emergency services there couldn't handle it. It sounds also like it was pretty chaotic everywhere. I want to go to a couple of quotes in the Times, which I think sort of highlight the extent of the problem. So this is from the Times. In Romney Marsh, Kent, RNLI volunteers, so that's the lifeguard people, lifeguard organization, discovered that revelers had used their station as a lavatory. Human feces was found behind bins, around the lifeboat charity shop, and even in the entrance used by crews rushing to take out the lifeboat on a Mayday call. A Kent resident gave this particular quote to the Times. It seems the government has sprung this on seaside towns and councils just aren't ready for the sudden influx of people. Until last week, there were no toilets open, no lifeguards on the beaches, and no police presence at all. Right? So you've got this situation where Boris Johnson says you can all go to the seaside. He doesn't really give councils any warning. Obviously, there aren't enough toilets for people in these places, especially as all the pubs and the shops are closed. And then, is it really a surprise that it's going to, you know, people are going to piss and shit everywhere? I mean, obviously now the newspapers are, you know, all demonizing these people. Like, how can these people have no respect whatsoever? It's like you tell people to go to somewhere and you don't provide any toilets, then, you know, things are going to get messy. I'm not saying you should go, you know, Bournemouth and shit on the pavement or whatever. But it's not a surprise that these things happen. And if the government can foresee them, they should act in a way that prevents, I mean, what sounds like a pretty nightmarish situation. Aaron, you're on the South Coast. What's it like where you are?
It's really interesting. I've been going around a few different town centres the last few days. I'm from Bournemouth. I've not been to Bournemouth. I was at Bournemouth last weekend. My dad's a taxi driver and he's been saying it's dead. Obviously, he's not going out much because of his health. That he's only doing really a few hours a day, but he's worried. It's dead. The entire economy's kind of just died. It sounds like in the last couple of days that's dramatically changed. But what I can tell from town centres is that you've got a situation where the town centres, the shops, the retail, the high street, nobody's there. And a lot of these shops are now open, right? The non-essential shops, the bookstores, the clothes stores, they're open, but nobody's there. What's happening instead is people are flooding to parks, to beaches. So you're not even getting the economic stimulus, people going back and shopping and buying things. We know that saving rates have gone slightly up during the pandemic, during the last 3 months, which means people probably have some people have some surplus cash to spend. They're not spending that, and therefore hopefully saving some jobs, saving some businesses. What they're doing instead is going to the beach, going to the park, quite rightly having a nice time, being with people, hanging out, having a laugh. And so that's going to be a concern for the government for a number of reasons. Why? Firstly, well, they're breaking lockdown, but they're exiting lockdown, but not in a way that is advantageous to the economy. And then secondly, they're doing all of that whilst underpinning a highly likely substantial increase in the transmission rates of coronavirus without it, like I say, having that sort of economic advantage and benefit at the same time. So it's you're looking at two different things. Like you go down a high street and you look at the retail kind of side of things, it looks like somebody's dropped a bomb on these places, quite frankly. Then you go to beaches and people are having a great time. And I think both of those things are really bad. Because even if we get a vaccine in 5-6 months, my personal view is, and let's say we give it to everybody in this country before the end of the year, the economy is dead by then. Millions of people are defaulting on their mortgages. Millions of jobs are gone. Many high street brands, which we all take for granted and are kind of iconic, disappear. That right now that's where we're heading. Particularly after August, I think we're going to see mass layoffs. And at the same time, it looks like we might have a second spike because so many people are going to parks and beaches and so on, and all with very few inhibitions. And why should they be inhibited? The government said they could go down there.
I mean, I should say I am pro people going to parks and beaches, but if the government knows this is going to happen, then obviously some preparations have to be made, and they don't seem to have made any preparations whatsoever. Boris Johnson, when asked about how they're going to be able to handle this, just said show some guts. He said encourage people to come to your town, right? He did though change his tune. So this is him speaking today. You'll notice the difference.
If you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world, where people have been coming out of lockdown, I'm afraid what you're also seeing is people taking too many liberties with the guidance, mingling too much, not observing social distance. So some parts of the world, I won't name them, but you've got spikes, really serious spikes in the incidence of the disease. So it's crucial that people understand that on July the 4th, we get this right. And we do this in a balanced way.
So he's saying that we have to get this right. Basically, he's implying that if there's any problems, it's because people aren't following the guidelines, right? And the examples he's saying, lots of places in the world, they're getting second spikes. I won't name them. I mean, he's probably talking about the United States and many countries in Latin America where you're getting these second spikes. And the reason you're getting second spikes isn't because people are failing to follow guidelines. It's because, one, in some places, say for example, Florida, the government introduced much looser guidelines, so you're getting more infections. And me and Aaron had a sort of dispute earlier. I think in a previous week, I still think that because the heat, it won't be the kind of spike that you saw in New York, but it's still a major increase in cases. In Latin America, it's more because either governments have failed to, or they don't have the financial capacity to properly subsidize people to stay at home. So you've got huge informal economies. It means that people really have no choice but to go outside. So in neither cases is the reason that you are seeing second spikes that people are just unwilling to follow the guidelines. The reasons are either that you've had an irresponsible government which has loosened the guidelines before they should have done, or you've got an economy which isn't properly compensating people when they self-isolate. And now let's come back to Britain. If we have a second spike, why is it going to be? It's not because people aren't following the guidelines. As we've heard in all of these press conferences, actually, the British public have been very good at following guidelines. The problem is going to be that, one, the government has changed the guidelines. They made it very unclear what you're allowed to do. They said you can all go to the beach, and then they've said when you all go to the beach, they say, well, if you all go to the beach, we'll have to close the beaches. So maybe you could have come up with some kind of system whereby the beaches can both be open, but not so busy whereby you ultimately have to close them straight away, or threaten people that you're going to close them straight away. And the other thing, if we're talking about this, the Latin American example where people can't really afford to self-isolate, the same is happening here, and we don't have any excuse because we're a very rich country that can borrow shed loads of money on the financial markets, right? We've got a test and trace system whereby if you get a text message to say you've been in contact with someone who has coronavirus, you're expected to stay in your house for 14 days with no financial compensation whatsoever. If you're self-employed, you're supposed to just, forego your income for 14 days. So, of course, if there's a second spike, it's not because people were so selfish that they couldn't follow the rules. It's because the government did not make it possible to follow the rules. And just, the switch between saying just everyone needs to have confidence to actually, you've all been way too confident. It's all your fault for being too loose with the guidelines. You made the freaking guidelines. Aaron.
No, I think you've encapsulated it very well. And there were a bunch of things they could have done. For instance, back in the day, in Athens, when it used to be, it still has massive issues with air pollution. You would only be able to use cars on a certain day. You'd only basically, if your number plate ended in a certain number, you couldn't drive it. We could have ended lockdown in a particular way where not everybody, you limit people from going to certain places, right? That's not to say certain people, you can't go to the beach, but not everybody can go to Bournemouth. In the south, in particular, the whole of London is desperate. It's desperate to go to the beach. Southend, Bournemouth, Brighton. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, that clearly could have been avoided. And it doesn't seem to be a scenario which the government was prepared for.
I mean, there are simple. So I was looking at what are other countries doing. There was an article in The Economist sort of explaining what's going on in the south of France. There you've got people who, can book a 3-hour slot in a particular part of the beach. So you're all arranging to go at different times, because what the government are basically saying at the moment is you can go to the beach, but try not to go all at the same time. And you can't, I mean, how do we know when everyone else is going to the beach? If you want people to be able to enjoy going to the beach, and I think we should all be able to enjoy going to the beach, you're less likely to catch COVID outside. The sun's, good for your health anyway, and it's very good for your mental health. I don't think we should be saying the options are either you have dangerously overcrowded beaches or you close the beach. What the point of a government who's capable of solving problems, which was supposed to be the whole Dominic Cummings argument. We're going to create the government that's the most creative, that can solve difficult problems and not have blunt solutions to problems. Is you make some kind of system where we can, coordinate with each other so that we don't all go to the beach at exactly the same time, and the government coordinates with local councils so that when coastal towns are getting more visitors than they expect, they have the capacity to have some more toilets around. Have some more, antibacterial whatever around. So true. Antiviral gel.
So true.
But they haven't done any of these things. They've just said to the public, try not to all go at the same. It doesn't make any. You're the freaking government.
Yeah, they could have gone the top 50 tourist destinations, which they expect to be rammed. They could have said, okay, let's get 5,000 sort of temporary toilets put in there. Let's get cleaning stations. Let's get stewards and so on. Life would have been hell for a lot of those stewards. There would have been altercations. They would tell people to move. But look, it's better than this free for all. And it's weird that, look, you look at Wetherspoons are saying, or what I talked about, Pure Gym are looking to reopen and the various things they're introducing. I mean, we can have an argument about whether or not they should reopen, but they're doing it in such a way that clearly they would have far lower rates of transmission than if they hadn't done the steps they're speculating about using. That isn't even a conversation for beaches, for parks, basically for all the places that the state administers, which aren't public services. And that's really troubling. What Pure Gym and Tesco and Wetherspoons have a plan about reducing transmission rates in public, but the government doesn't. Very troubling.
So true. And I mean, who's going to do that? Who's going to make sure that people know where to go, etc., etc. 750,000 people applied to be NHS volunteers, and you didn't really get any of them to do anything, which is fine. Maybe there wasn't as much need, but there clearly is need in the economy for people to be coordinating people so that we can all live as normal lives as possible without having, super spreader occasions. Anyway, we're gonna leave it tonight. I always enjoy these Friday shows with you, Aaron. Thank you everyone for your super chats. If you want to support us directly, then please do go to novaramedia.com/support. I'd say don't all go to the beach at the same time, but obviously that's a stupid thing to say because it's impossible to coordinate. Anyway, I'm repeating myself now. We'll be back on Monday. Do hit subscribe to make sure you never miss a show. You've been watching Tisky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.